I feel so odd because my clap is like 2 octaves lower than yours. And I'm like, what am I doing with my
What are you
hands?
doing that's different? Well, I did more of like a flat. I think you like, I don't know what you were doing. Maybe we just clap different. I don't know what does it say about us as people? I don't know. Is this like that's like a it's some kind of weird like horoscope thing? Like your clap will tell you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Some predictive bullshit. Welcome back to Give Up After 3, a critical analysis of BBC's Sherlock, examining each episode to understand how things went so wrong that fans invented a secret final episode to justify why the show had been bad all along. You can find show notes and sources at zeroindent.com/giveupafter3. And if you want episodes early or just want to support us, you can head over to patreon.com/zeroindent. I'm DC McNeil, author and editor-in-chief at Zero Indent, and I'm joined, as always, by YouTuber Darth. How you doing, Darth?
Hello there.
You know what?
I'm workshopping. I'm workshopping new hellos, by the way.
Oh, okay.
I've reached out to all my nerd friends, and I'm like, I need something else because everyone does hello there. I need something else, but I'm gonna stick with it for now, especially with Kenobi being all the rage right now. So
maybe you can go in seasons. You know what I mean? You can phase it out, phase a new one in, see how it suits you. You know what I mean? Well, look, we're back. I think both collectively were dreading this episode a little bit. We're talking about this season 2, episode 2, The Hounds of Baskerville, directed by Paul McGowan, whose name I've never said correctly and will never. It's written by Mark Gatiss. The original air date was the 8th of January 2012, so about a week after the previous episode. Initially had a viewership of about 10.27 million UK viewers. Content disclaimer on this one, as with some of these, this one in particular deals a lot with like trauma, self-harm and anxiety, and there's a bit of suicide and depression in there as well. And this was adapted from the Hounds of Baskerville's, note the Moffatism of Baskerville versus Baskervilles. We'll talk about it later. Darth, what did you think coming back to this one? I know we were both pretty worried about it at the end of last week's recording. How did you feel coming into it this time?
while watching, I was not enjoying it quite as much. And then once I started kind of thinking more about like thematically what they were trying to do, then I started appreciating it a whole lot more. Because it was very intentionally the opposite tone and the opposite visual aesthetic of the prior episode. And once you start viewing like everything that you're seeing as a part of the lens that the filmmakers were trying to do it intentionally, as opposed to just this story is sad and depressing, and mildly boring and confusing, but so it had some redeeming qualities once you start looking at that. We had like all the opulent palaces last time, and the guest characters were all beautiful and well groomed and well dressed. And then it was like this fun mystery romp that had like a romance tied in. And this one is just, it's like a mystery monster that could be real, and this guy might kill himself. Like it's hardcore compared to what we had last time.
Yeah, it's bleak as hell.
Yeah.
Interesting, because I had a similar reaction where I was kind of bored the whole time, but then I think part of this is the first time that I felt stupid for taking like the show seriously in a certain sense, like treating this as like a literary object. As I was watching this episode, I was like, okay, fine. Yeah, listen, I get what they were going for, and I think it's the first time they've just been like, let's just do a case. Let's just have an episode where the lads do a case. Doesn't have to be connected to Moriarty. It can just be a case. And I appreciated that aspect. But it also, I think, there's something to it that, like, because the previous show is so consistently about the same kinds of things, like you were saying, this episode's cool because it's standalone, but it also feels weirdly out of place. And we'll kind of talk about, like, I guess the pros and cons of that approach. But yeah, I had a very similar reaction. I think there's some really cool stuff in here. But there's also some stuff where I don't fully understand why some decisions were made the way they were. And I guess we'll get into that a little bit. For your context as well, historically, this is the episode where the theory crafting apparatus of Tumblr really sinks its teeth in. Like, this one is like, people are starting to write like essay length metas about this stuff, and so we'll delve into some of that as well. I suspect this will be a bit of a shorter episode just by the nature of the content of this particular episode of the show. So let's just get straight into it. So we'll start with the summary. which is relatively brief because, like, all in all, not a lot happens, which isn't a bad thing. So Henry Knight recruits Holmes and Watson to Dartmoor to investigate reportings of a demon hound that Knight saw as a child. As they investigate the area, they come across Baskerville, a top-secret military research facility. Holmes and Watson go to the moors with Knight, and Holmes claims to see the hound along with Knight. Lestrade then arrives at Mycroft's behest, and the gang close in on a theory. Holmes suspects he has been drugged, and at Baskerville, after torturing Watson for no particular reason, we discover that Hound was a chemical weapons program trying to weaponize fear. It turns out that Dr. Franklin is behind Knight's Hound. Franklin is convinced the drug will still work, and along with Lestrade, Holmes and Watson crack the case and stop Franklin's experiments once and for all, uncovering in fact that Franklin was responsible for Knight's father's demise, not a demon hound. So, as far as like a series of events, not a tremendous amount of like kind of big plotty things. I think the previous summaries have been a lot more like kind of plot stuff. This one's just sort of more about the nuance of, I guess, the particular interactions, the particular moments. So we'll kind of, I guess I'll start by describing the opening. So there's this, okay, there is a cold open that we get, which you did acknowledge before we press record, which is there's a young boy kind of running through the woods, obviously afraid of this hound in the darkness. And then we kind of cut to the beginning of our episode. So before I kind of get into, I guess, the framing, which, as you say, the episode feels so divorced from the tone of the previous show that I had almost forgotten the opening we get with Sherlock here. Talk to me about the cold open before I kind of set up Sherlock and Watson.
So we had talked a bit off camera about it, but the idea that I had was that they needed this cold open to be out there on the moor. It's bleak. It sets the tone. It has the kid crying, and then it cuts to him as an adult. So we have established that we established a little bit of backstory that this happened in the past. Something terrible happened to the kid. Then he grew up. He's still haunted by it, and he's still out in this haunted-looking, bleak place. We could like look at the clothes he's wearing. We could see the fact that he's alone. Just all of these different things immediately can kind of set the tone of what we're expecting for the overall story. But all of these things are also just like pure filmmaking. Like, this is all stuff that you want to establish right off the bat that doesn't necessarily tie into the story, which is kind of what you were saying is the reason you didn't really care for this cold open, is it doesn't necessarily have to be there for the overall story to make sense. But for a film, it might be necessary for character establishment, for location establishment, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's an interesting tension, right? And I think this is something that happens a lot in text, which is like the tension between the medium it's in and the content itself can be tricky. Like, the reason that structurally I cut this, so I mentally cut this as well, which you'll note in my notes. I'm like, I cut this cold open from my brain. The reason for that is most mystery stories open with like we said a few episodes ago, they open with like a body or something, like there's something to investigate. And this is that structurally. It's being like, hey, this thing happened as a kid. This is the mystery we are going to investigate. The challenge with that, I think, is you're right. From a filmmaking perspective, it sets the tone well. The challenge I think it presents is that it doesn't like quite have enough information in it for it to like really give us anything to be like, I wonder what's going on. As you say, it's just a tone setting piece. There's some absence here of like, I was hoping for some kind of hook, like something that we would be like, oh, what does that mean? You know how in the first episode where it was like, these unconnected suicides, and you're like, wow, that's a really interesting, like, I wonder what's going on. There's just not enough information here for you to have that same reaction. And I don't know why that is specifically, but it just didn't grab me in the way that I was wanting it to.
Well, I had kind of wondered if it tied into what you said, that this was kind of when the audience was really getting into it and doing all of these blogs that were getting famous in their own right. So the creators had to be reading these things as well. So this entire open could have been very intentional, that they are giving something completely different. They are giving like it's like a psychological thriller to start off with, where you don't know what's real and all this. And they might be doing that exactly to throw off the audience, who thinks that everything like the audience thinks like Sherlock. They're like, everything is exact and everything is linear and everything makes sense and everything has evidence. And then they get this cold open and they're like, this doesn't make sense. This isn't Sherlock.
It feels it feels very different. You're right. Yeah, and that does, I guess, reset. The problem is it's then followed by like just a ton of Sherlock nonsense. It's so because as you're saying that, I'm like, oh man, that is a really good point. And then we just get like 5 minutes of bullshit. Like it's this show just cannot seem to make up its mind about how it's going to approach things. So I guess
But he's holding a spear while he's doing all that, so it's awesome.
Okay, so let me explain what is happening with Sherlock and Watson. I want to be clear. I don't hate this. I didn't hate it. I just think it's absurd in comparison to the cold open. Anyway, so Sherlock, in the throes of a violent nicotine fit, he's trying to quit off. He's going cold turkey, and apparently a perfect frenzy of boredom pines for a case to work on. After a ridiculous email from a child who asks him to find her luminous rabbit named Bluebell, the boys are visited by Henry Knight, a man whose father was violently ripped apart by a gigantic hound on Dartmoor 20 years earlier. Henry, then a small child, fled in terror, only to be found the next morning. After years of being unsure whether or not it was a false illusion of his imagination, Henry has visited the hollow where the killing occurred and found gigantic paw prints of a dog, prompting him to come to Holmes for help. Although initially dismissive, Sherlock suddenly becomes interested after being struck by Henry's use of the archaic word hound. Sherlock agrees to head to Dartmoor. I want to say, to your point about the filmmaking in this opening section is really on point. The way that Knight is framed, he's sort of every shot he's in, he's isolated from the subject, like the other subjects in the room, like Holmes and Watson, either like by something that is obscuring him or something that is occluding at least partially some of him in darkness. It is really well done. The dialogue, okay. The Holmes and the spear and the nicotine addiction is dumb and it's annoying, but I get it. I get what they're doing. It's fine. I'm gonna have this complaint commonly, which is it's too silly in a way that really like rides against what they're going for, but I don't hate it. If it was me, I would have changed this. I would have like kind of resequenced it a little bit. I would have changed a bit of the tone of it to make it a bit more kind of like, not serious, but I would have taken away some of the goofiness of it if I was going to sort of suggest how they should change this. There is some nice stuff character work wise. You have, Sherlock trying to trick John, and he's like, I'll let you know next week's lottery numbers. I think it's cool that John knows that Sherlock can't do that. Like, he knows that there's a limit to this. But yeah, I'll talk about the SFX stuff in a second. But do you have any notes on, like, I guess, seeing the boys in their natural habitat, as it were?
So yeah, I had 6 different notes in this first scene here, and just starting off at the top with the harpoon thing, the bit of dialogue that he gives when he walks back in the door and he just slams the spear down and he goes, "That was tedious," and like that reaction, the line may be goofy, but like the idea behind it, that he was theoretically out harpooning some living animal and he had to do that not to die, and his reaction was not, "Oh, that was scary," or blah blah blah. It was, "That was tedious." Like, that's really interesting from a character perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So like I found that line just fascinating, and the fact that he's just like covered with the guts and blood and oil or whatever, and still it's like he doesn't look perturbed, he doesn't look unnerved, and that's probably all tying in to the end of this episode. And it's probably supposed to be a direct contradiction with, he could face death and be totally unperturbed by it, but then he faces this thing that he doesn't understand, and he totally loses everything.
Yes.
Which was really cool, and I did not realize that until right this very second.
Yeah, it's one of these things of like, you can feel, and this is where I think a Gatiss written episode is interesting, because you can feel his very very practiced hand when it comes to these structural apparatus, right? The idea that like Sherlock isn't afraid of physical violence, but is afraid of things he doesn't understand or can't comprehend is an important characterization, especially given where this season ends up going next episode. I think it's a really critical, like, sort of component of his makeup.
Now, one interesting thing about that is the fact that he went alone, because it's like been really well established that he needs John with him, whether just out of loneliness or what. It's never like super definitive, but he always has to have John there. and he doesn't. And the multiple times that we've seen this when he goes off and does something by himself, it's because that's either part of a joke that the writers want to make, and the only way to make that joke is to have Sherlock come back and explain something to Watson, therefore Sherlock had to go by himself, or it's part of a mandatory plot point where Sherlock has to go off by himself in order for John to get kidnapped or put in danger or something like that.
Yeah.
So, like, I just realized how little it tracks some of the different things that we see kind of happening behind the scenes, and how those things are only happening from a writing perspective because they need XYZ. So he's doing something out of character.
Yes, it's behavior in service of the plot instead of. So do you remember last time we were talking about this idea that characters don't exist. They're not people, right? They don't exist by themselves. They are vehicles for which a plot is delivered. And one of the things that can happen as a writer, and this happens a lot on TV, because you have to, like, you're writing a lot of stuff. Okay, like, not this show specific. I mean, the show has a long runtime, but, like, usually you're writing a lot of episodes, and sometimes you need to have a character. Sometimes you need to get a plot thing to happen, and to do that, you have to have a character do something against, like, their usual behavior. What's interesting about this is the dialogue isn't that. Like, the characters are behaving like themselves as they talk to each other, but you're right, it's the setup of what they're doing and how they got there that just, like, doesn't quite. Like, it feels, you're like, it feels a bit off in a way that is hard to identify.
Yeah, and, like, it would have made sense, and it would have tracked logically if John had immediately said, "You were in danger, why didn't you take me with you?"
Yes.
Like, then, yeah, so, like, very, very little things. I understand exactly what you're saying, that sometimes they have to act out of character in order for something to happen, but having the characters ignore that they act out of character is what is really triggering about it. It wasn't the action, it was just ignoring the action.
And you're right, half a sentence would have solved that. Or, like, even if Watson was like, well, I was busy doing X, Y. You know, like really little things can help you smooth over, I guess, that tension between character and plot requirements, I guess.
So you mentioned the nicotine thing, and that's something that, to me, it felt like it came out of nowhere, because he has been handling this fine. He's the only reason he put on the patches in the episodes that we've seen were to help him solve a problem. He put on the patches to give him an extra mental boost. Mm-hmm. He wasn't doing it to kick a habit. In the previous episode, we saw him smoke it maybe just once, maybe it was twice, but either way, it was a gift with his brother. It was not something that he needed, and he didn't even smoke the whole thing. He had like half of it and then put it out. So this addiction came out of nowhere, even though it might track logically, but it still came out of nowhere, and they were treating it like his drug addiction that we haven't seen addressed since episode 1, where the cops were in there searching his entire flat. So it would have made a lot more sense to me for this not to be nicotine, but for him to have gone after something hard, a hard drug, because he didn't have anything exciting in his mysteries, so he was going back to the hard stuff. That would have made so much more sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of why people like theorizing about this show, is that, like, because you look at that and you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Like it feels off. It's kind of goofy. If you scrutinize it for a minute, you're like, oh, surely they've thought about this more, because this just seems like an unforced error, right? Like, that's literally what it just feels like, an unforced error. And so people are like, well, the showrunners keep saying this is a really smart show that's all connected. There's a lot more going on than you think. But then when I watch it, this stuff doesn't make sense. So there must be something else going on with this. And so you can see that natural instinct, which is like, I guess the non-critical reaction, which is like, well, this needs to make sense, because, like, otherwise this is just like a mistake. And it feels like a mistake to me. It feels like the kind of mistake, exactly what you're saying, where they were like, we needed something harder, but for the tone of what's occurring, like, you couldn't have like, if you had Sherlock on the harpoon thing and then he was trying to quit, like, heroin or something, it just completely changes the dynamic of, like, what it feels like is appropriate to get away with tonally. But that's weird to me, because they're already setting up the episode to be so dark. So why not take out the goofiness and just really lean into, like, maybe it is like a really serious issue he's trying to trying to overcome, and that would have a lot more, I guess, internal consistency with the tone of this episode. But then you risk alienating certain viewers who like to see the goofy, fun time boys doing fun shit. And so I think there's this tension here of like, they don't go for it. I think it's again a really self-deflationary maneuver where they don't go for this really obvious, to me, really, really obvious great opportunity with these characters to give us a bit more depth, to give us a bit more of like a serious moment. They don't go for it because they don't want to like, they don't want to risk alienate. I don't know if this is the reason. I'm saying this is textually how it comes across. They don't want to necessarily alienate, their characters and have people be like, well, Sherlock Holmes is a heroin addict. Boy, that's a bridge too far. They don't want to kind of have that potential reaction. So it seems safer to be like, it's obviously cigarettes. It seems like a safer, I guess, route to go.
Yeah. And something that's along those lines is he acts like a big jerk multiple times, and first off in this scene with Henry. And the idea, I think, was supposed to be that he was just extra on nerves because coming off of the nicotine.
Yes.
But at the same time, it makes it feel like his entire character arc has just poofed. Like, he has had all of this growth where he's been developing human compassion, and they just poofed it away for a little joke about the nicotine. And, like, that doesn't make sense. Like, you have to take him on a whole new character arc now in order to get back to where he was before.
Something that we've acknowledged that I think is worth saying again, just like real explicitly, is that sometimes with this show, every episode, it feels like these are different characters. Like, it feels like that they are just in like completely different parts of their life. And I think the way that they try and I'm going to use the phrase get away with this. It's not exactly what I mean. But there's such a nebulous amount of time between episodes. Like, things aren't directly contiguous. It's not like one episode ends and then we pick up the next like thread. There's some amount of time between them. And I think that's what lets them try and get away with that more. Where they're like, oh, but you don't know what happened between, last time and this time. And it's like, yeah, but that's true, but that doesn't make it enjoyable to watch. Like, I think there's Yeah, I agree.
So I had a couple more points. One, which I've loved looking at this now because you were the one that brought it up, is looking at each of his solves and trying to figure out, is it possible? So the napkin solve. I think that it's theoretically possible, but you have to be Superman to see the evidence. This little smudge of ketchup at the corner of his mouth, a little smudge of ketchup on his sleeve, to be able to actually see the tiny numbers on the napkin when it's upside down and facing away from you and all this stuff. Like, it's possible, but you need like binoculars or something.
It's the same problem as like where that dude, remember like a few episodes ago, that dude had like the wallet with the whatever currency was in it, and you're like, his watch, and it's like we can't see that shit. Like, it's not. Yeah, it's frustrating because it's there, but they just don't. Yeah. They don't find a creative way to show it.
And it's weird. Like, my first reaction is to talk about magicians, because it's like the writers come up with a cool idea for a mystery, a cool idea for a solve, but then they don't look at it like from the audience perspective. Like, when a magician comes up with an act, they have to think not just how do I do it, but what does it look like from their point of view?
Yes.
And so they are never looking at it from the audience point of view and saying, could they actually see this little tiny detail that Sherlock can see? So, I don't know. It's something they're never going to figure out, that they have this like handicap.
You're also never going to stop seeing it now that you're aware of it in this show. Like, I'll talk about this a bit later, but like, this episode really crosses a divide with its use of the Sherlock vision shit. I don't know, whatever you want to call it, like the SFX stuff. Once, like, after this episode, the tool gets used completely differently. Like, this is really a bridging moment for the style of the production. But the notion that in a detective story you should have the information should be available to the audience to consume because the show has to be enjoyable to watch gets completely discarded. Like, they're like, we don't care if this is fun for you or not. It's about how clever we can be as writers. That is the thing that starts to feel like, whether or not it's happening, that is the way that, meaning is not made in the construction of the object, it's made in its reception. And in the reception of this text, it feels that way. And so when we talk about Death of the Author in season 3, something that we're going to dote on in some detail is like, who gets to say that Sherlock should be enjoyable to watch? Like, is that a valid claim to make? Should this show be enjoyable for the audience to watch? Is a question that we'll get into. And I don't think there's a clear answer, but yes, we'll call some more attention to detail when we get to the Hound solve to this particular problem and as it starts to balloon out. But you've kind of identified like the thing that I was flagging to you in episode 1 of this show, and you've brought that to the table yourself. So I feel like I've fully converted you now. I feel like I've broken your brain. So welcome to the club. You're welcome.
So I had 2 more points. One of them's small. One of them's pretty big. But when they're leaving, I cannot figure out for the life of me why the writers had Sherlock be such a drama queen about whether he was going or he was not going. Because at first he's like, I'm sending John. He's my top man. He can handle it. I'm going after Bluebell. And then they're like, really? Are you serious? He's like, no, I'm not serious. I'm coming with you. Are you serious? No, I'm joking. You're going by yourself. And they do that
weird.
like twice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't get it. Like, is he just being a dick?
I
Like, I was just...
Maybe...
This is baffling.
Yeah, maybe he was just happy that he has something to focus on, and so when he's happy, he's just a dick.
But, like,
I don't
it wasn't
know.
really a joke. Like, Sherlock does a joke later in this episode, and I was like, oh, that was an attempt at humor. But, like, I don't... Yeah, they do this a lot, where he's just, like, needlessly contrarian for no reason. I think they're trying to be like, this is a character flaw he has to work on, but he never does.
All right. I was just curious if that confused you as much as it did me.
It's baffling.
So I'm okay. So the biggest takeaway for me in this was that 11 minutes 24 seconds roughly into the episode, and we have the solve. We have it. You may have glanced over it, but
what?
John solves it. Yeah, John solves it already. So John is like taking notes. He's got his notepad and he's like writing down stuff Henry is saying. Sherlock mentions something about the psychiatrist, and John says, well, do you think all of this is in your head? Do you think that you just imagined, you made up the dog as a way of coping, blah, blah, blah? And Sherlock says, Henry says, yeah, that's exactly what my psychiatrist said. So right off the bat, both John and the psychiatrist have already diagnosed, like, yes, there's something that's causing the hallucinations that he's having, but still, they diagnosed exactly the solve for this case.
Damn.
11 minutes into the episode.
I don't know if I love or hate that. I didn't even notice that. For the audio listener, I was making the most face I've ever made while I was listening. That's really interesting.
And it's the same thing. They've done this before. Because remember, in A Study in Pink, we see 3 taxi cabs within the first, like, a minute of the show. So they are consistently giving away the solve in the opening. They're just doing it so subtly that you won't be able to realize it until you see the end.
That is interesting. Yeah, but I think A Study in Pink is a bit different because a thing that has to happen. Well, I guess they do this to an extent. It's like the way that like our brains work typically when it comes to like things like this in text. So like a payoff in a text is like usually you set it up, so you have the initial mention of the setup, then you have a reminder, and then you have the payoff. So the reminder is usually like subtly along the way somewhere. Think of this typically as like in a normal murder mystery, you'll get the setup, which is like you meet somebody who could be the potential murderer. You'll get the reminder, which is usually a form of like a red herring, so you'll think someone else did it, and then the payoff is like, oh no, it turned out to be them all along, which is interesting. I think, do I like this? I do. I think my problem with this scene is not the information in it, but its conveyance, which I'll talk about in a second. But that's fascinating. What do you think about that? Because I didn't even notice.
I mean, my initial thought was anger, because the only reason to include that is the writers trying to do something smart, trying to outwit the audience. Because a lot of the time, if you have a character definitively state, I think this is the solution, then the audience will be like, oh, well, that must be it. I don't need to watch the rest of it. So the only reason to put this in was for them to intentionally trick the audience to think, oh, no, that's not it. So maybe they put it in there as a way of making us think, oh, it can't be in his head. Yep. It has to be real.
100%.
So if that's their reasoning, then I'm more okay with it than them just putting it in to try to be smarter than their audience member.
I think it must be that because they then have him be like, I have this thing of a paw print. So like they are literally being like, this is a physical thing. Take it out of your mind that it could be made up. And it's like, well, yeah, it's just like I get it. I get the misdirect, but like it just it feels a bit disingenuous to. It feels like they're dunking on us a little bit, which they do a lot. They gotta start doing it more.
Which is and that's a huge point about Bluebell that I'll bring up later. But
I love that. It's like it's the one part of it where I'm like, it's an interesting maneuver, Steve. Interesting maneuver. I have one more note on this scene, which is. Yeah. So we've talked before about this VFX style that the show does. For those watching or listening who haven't seen the show, the VFX style is like they sort of will do these kind of flash zooms in on different objects, and they will often overlay text and play sound effects that correlate with the object. It's supposed to represent Sherlock's like high attention to detail. So for example, in this scene, Sherlock's talking about the girl writing her number on a napkin, and so we flash zoom onto the napkin and we hear the sound of a pen writing, because Steve thinks we don't know how pens are. And this is the episode for me where it's the beginning of the end of this making any sense. There's one episode later in season 4 that the style absolutely works in, but moving forward, it's just going to get sillier and sillier. There is this, as Sherlock is describing Knight's... keep in mind, this is Sherlock describing Knight's trip on a train. We get a sound effect for everything. Like the coffee, the meal, the pen on the napkin, the scrunching up, everything. And it is like once you start to like pay, if you're watching this along with us, start to pay attention to how they use this stuff. We'll talk about it in the Hounds solve. It's too much. Like it's too much, and it's a bit silly, and it kind of feels like they're talking down to us a little bit, being like, see, like this is how, like if only you'd notice this, you fucking moron. This is how pens sound on paper. It's like it's too much for me, and it starts to become a bit like. Instead of it being a tool where, like it was in the first episode, where it's used to present us evidence and then we're given time to try and solve it before Sherlock, now it's just a fun time tool to show us how awesome Sherlock is. Like it's changed its mode of use, I think.
Well, as a possible contradiction to that stand, one of the big things we've said before is you can't talk about something and not show it. That's mainly been in our Star Wars stuff. And since we're not seeing what he's seeing, we're just kind of like, we're not actually seeing inside the train or whatever. So what if having those sound effects is the, alternative to that? He's describing something. If we're not going to see it, we have to hear it. Maybe they overdid, they could have lowered it a few decibels or whatever, but still, that might be something that is just making the story concrete for the audience, because we're not getting that visual representation. We have to have that audio cue of what he's talking about.
See, that's possible, but like, again, that's like, you must think your audience is pretty fucking stupid. Like, we all know what trains are. Like, it's this, like, I agree that as a mechanism, that is definitely why they're doing it, but it's a little condescending. Like, it's... And so this is a thing, this is a style that Moffat pioneered in Jekyll. And if you want to go and see the roots of this and why it gets so silly, if you go and watch Jekyll, you can absolutely see this. He does the exact same, like, you know that sound effect when it like kind of goes, it zooms in and it's like whoosh, there's like a whoosh where it like kind of telescopes in. That sound effect is literally in Jekyll, and they do the same thing. And you can see the bones of that style being developed, and then here he finally has the budget to pull it off, but does not have the restraint to know when to use it and when not to use it. And I think comparing the use from the first episode to this, the first episode, it's largely used to present us evidence, as we was just saying, that we couldn't see otherwise, because we don't have supervision. It's used to communicate information that Sherlock is noticing that we can't, because it's a fucking TV show and we're not physically there. Whereas here, it's almost reversed, where it's like, it's used for Sherlock to show off the solve instead of present the evidence for the solve, if that makes sense. Like, there is a difference, I think, in its deployment. We'll maybe talk about it as we get in further. But I don't disagree with your point. I just think if that is true, that's still a bit disappointing, I
want to think on this one a bit, because I initially want to say that I love the style of filmmaking where you have sounds associated with things that don't necessarily have sound to them. Like when you have a camera move and you hear the whoosh, there's no whoosh. They intentionally make camera rigs so they don't make sounds when you're moving them, and it's all ADR anyway, so you're not going to hear anything. But I love the stylistic decision to be able to mentally have, audible connected to visual. To have both of those together really resonates with me, and I wonder if that's just a difference in the psychology of the two different viewers, or how we process information. It might be that I'm a very audible person and I want to hear something. I'd be really interested to kind of delve into why it doesn't bother me, and I appreciate having those sound effects, whereas to you it's nails on a chalkboard.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's also because like I've been thinking about this text for 12 years. Like I've been thinking about Sherlock, or 10 years rather, because it's 10 years. 12 years, 2010. So I've been thinking about this literally for 10 years as a literary object. So for me, as the critic, what I noticed is not necessarily, to be really clear, I think that this is fine. Like, I think that doing this in your show is a fine decision. I think that having this be a stylistic flourish of a show is perfectly fine, and an interesting choice, and a good one sometimes. My issue with it is not the stylistic flourish. It's not the way that they play the sound effects when we're seeing what's happening. It's the deployment of this technique. In the same way that I would have an issue with, in the same way that I have an issue with, say, like we were talking about last week, someone like Joe Rowling saying, "Oh yeah, Dumbledore's gay," and there's no evidence of that in the text. The deployment of a tool is as important, if not more important, as its existence at all. And so when I talk about this stuff, I think it's really important that we draw a delineation between what my personal taste is, and then what I think, how effective I think this is in the text. Because for me, I think it's cool, but I think it's cool in a way that tricks you as the viewer into thinking there is more going on than there is. And when we talk about the Hounds solve, I think we can kind of try and pick that apart a little bit. But what I'm interested in, as you say, is if we keep paying attention to this as the show goes on, I'm curious to see where your opinion of it as a viewer and your opinion of it as a critic start to diverge. Because there is a certain point for me where that does happen. And I noticed it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, because there have been some movies and some scenes where you see that same style used, and I think that's wrong for the scene.
Yeah.
That's wrong for the tone.
Yeah.
Especially if it's like a funeral scene and you say the same kind of stuff. So I definitely agree that it can be entirely situational, and that a lot of directors don't know when or when not to have these things in. Personally, I think it fits with this, but I haven't been thinking about it for the past decade plus.
True.
So
True.
Give me some time. Let's set a calendar date, and
I have an exact moment. It will be season 3, episode 2, at about 59 minutes in. Is probably roughly in the episode where you will go, "Holy fuck, Dave was right." And I guarantee it. And we'll see. I'm hoping this is what I was hoping this structure of the show would do, and the method will pay off. Is that as we start to examine this stuff more, our ability to diagnose and understand textually what's going on grows as we consume more of this text in this kind of particular method. And I think that literary forensic mode is going to really pay off when we get to talking about this stuff, particularly in season 4, where it just gets absolutely fucking buck wild. They get so fucking crazy. They get so crazy with it. And there's one episode that's like one of the best... do I believe this? Yeah. It could be one of the best filmed pieces of television out there. There's an episode of this show which is like stylistically one of the coolest things I've ever seen, and it is one of the worst told stories I've ever seen. And that tension between aesthetic and text, I think that I'm hoping we'll begin to start to see that evolve a bit more, and it is in this episode and that particular hound scene. So let's keep moving, because we'll keep talking about this for literally hours. And I will. Don't worry. So Sherlock and John, basically they start to interview people around Dartmoor. There's like a local vegetarian pub thing. It's weird. And an inn.
Is that a thing? Is that a thing overseas where you just have vegetarian pubs?
I've been to England, and this is just not in 2000. like 12. This is a weird, very weird vibe. Like, I just never seen. You go to a pub, they're like, we're gonna sell you like roast beef and chips. Like, that's what pubs in England will sell you. I've never. Yeah, it's weird.
Okay, so this is just a forced plot point, so they
Yes.
can have the dog reveal later. Okay.
Yeah, it's very forced. I so the idea here is that the Hound has become like a local legend. It's bringing in tourists, that kind of thing. They're all coming to see it. Do you have any notes on, I guess, this setup before we talk about Baskerville?
So during this scene, they go outside and they're talking with the tour guide, who's a young, older teenager or something, and he shows them like this big cast he took of the dog print, and then one thing that I loved was the interaction that John just walks up while Sherlock is already talking to the dude, and Sherlock starts BSing about a bet that they had, and John just immediately picks up on it and is like, oh yeah, 50 quid, yeah. So I love that we see that that's all backstory off screen. You know, we haven't seen that kind of develop on screen, so it brings us more into the world. It's a great little bit of world building and character building that it just flowed so naturally.
Completely
so I
agree.
really love that, and I love that he never gave the money back.
It's pretty good. It's pretty
He
good.
was like, you're a jerk, I'm keeping it.
Exactly right. I also like I like the boys having a beer. I like seeing John and Sherlock just have a pint. I thought that, like, I know it sounds like a little thing, but there is a sense to which this episode is very tonally different, like you've already identified. And one of the things that's tonally different about it is, like, we get to see them in a different mode of engagement. They're not in London, they're elsewhere, and that for some reason feels like it frees them up to behave a bit differently. And I think it's a really cool little kind of flourish. Is like because when you go to these country towns, there's nothing to do but drink at the local pub. Like, that's the only thing to do. And so there's an extent to which you can feel Gatus's like little bit of like his sprinkle, the thing he's good at as a writer, which is like kind of the specificity and the kind of way that he taps into the ordinary in a very kind of like specific way. I really appreciate that about this whole sequence.
Now, there's something I'm kind of surprised that you skipped over, because there was another gay joke thrown in there.
Yeah, I wasn't going to talk about it because it sucks. I was saying to you the other night, like, so I've watched this episode 2.5 times now, and I find some of the content so exhausting, and like I don't. Why make the people that own the restaurant gay? For that joke. That's why, like, you can't just have gay characters in a Stephen Moffat script. It can't happen. It has to be for a bit about. There has to be a gay joke. You can't just have two people be gay. It has to be a gay joke. Fuck off. Stop it. It's really like is starting to frustrate me a lot with this show. Like, just let characters be gay, Steve. You don't have to address it. It's fine. They can just be gay. Fucking drives me mental. Sorry.
Yeah.
I wasn't gonna bring it up because I knew I was gonna get mad.
They had that entire bit talking about the one dude snoring, and like that entire thing would have been perfectly fine, except it was all just to build up to saying, what does yours do at night? Like, the entire thing was just for that joke. If cut that joke and it's fine, but it's just so weird to think that in the writer's brain that gay characters exist to create the opportunity for gay jokes.
Yes, exactly.
Which is just weird.
It's just not. It reduces. We talked about this before, and I might do some digging and probably talk about Goblin Theory properly a bit later. But it does relate back to Goblin Theory, which I think I talked about in maybe like episode 1, which is the idea that there is a tendency for some writers to write certain stereotypes as the same thing, where they imagine like a group of people as one set of behaviors. So like an example would be like in Stephen Moffat's work, all gay guys are the same type of person. They all have the same kind of personality. And it limits the degrees of their behavior. So like we talked about last episode, where you have that spectrum of interaction, it kind of isolates somebody based on one trait. So it's like, if you're gay, these are the types of things that you can do and say and how you say them. Whereas it's like, oh, if you're a police officer, these are the things that you can do or say and the way that you'll say them. And this for me is like, It suggests, and I'm again, what is in a text and what a writer believes are not the same thing. I'm not suggesting that Stephen Moffat thinks of gay people this way. The claim I would make is that his text presents particularly gay men. We'll talk a lot about gay women when we get to like season 4, but like he particularly presents gay men as basically all being the same guy. Like it feels to me like Moffat knows one or two gay people or a gay couple, and he just goes, well, that's everybody always, and anyone that's gay behaves that way. And it is kind of like, I don't use the problematic, but it is lazy at best and really insulting at worst. Is I guess when we talk about this stuff, yeah.
It's also interesting because from a writer's perspective, like I totally get that, because stereotyping, it has negative connotations, but stereotyping is how we identify people and classify them. And it's something that I've always said is a writer shouldn't be like a solo person. It shouldn't even necessarily be a team, because they don't have this world experience. If you only have one black friend, one Asian friend, you can't write a black or Asian character. You have to have other people who have experience with all of these different demographics, all of these different walks of life, whatever. And that just ties in so perfectly with what you're saying, that it feels like there's one thing that they are pulling from, and you see that in almost any show. Like a Free Guy immediately popped into my head where they have like the muscle bound character, the version of Ryan, that's the stereotype of the muscle jock bodybuilder. Mm-hmm. Like that's literally what you picture. Mm-hmm, and mm-hmm.
Yeah, to your point, I guess, to make something really explicit, stereotype is, again, it's a tool like anything else, and tools can be deployed well or they can be deployed poorly. And something that I want to be really clear about here, because I think this sometimes gets misconstrued, because people will make a claim. There is somebody right now who is going to send me an email. I guarantee this. Someone is going to send me an email and be like, you guys are just woke, the woke police, blah, 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 blah. And they're gonna suggest that the underlying politics is the issue. Now, while my underlying politics is like, it means that I find this like really offensive. I just think it's an offensive thing to do. I'm not that interested in discussing that. I'm more interested in, this is just like, Moffat should be a better writer by now. Like, I've watched Coupling. I've watched Jekyll. He is capable of writing really complicated male characters. But for some reason, the second they're gay, they just flatten. Obviously, he's not good at writing women. I think like that is something we will talk about. I don't necessarily think that is a... how to say, a lot of writers of his generation have the same kind of problem with women. You look at someone like Stephen King, who spent a lot of his early career writing women in a particular type of way, writing black characters in a particular type of way, was a lot better at dealing with homosexuality, I think, than a lot of other writers that were contemporary to him. But when you look at someone like Moffat, it's like, in this show, as a showrunner, you should be better about this stuff. Like, you need to be more disciplined as the voice and the style of the show. You need to be like pushing for just like better scripts. Like, this is just shitty and lazy is I guess the thing that's most disappointing to me, above any of the politics and things like that. It is just lazy and bad. And like, we should expect more from a guy who keeps, for some reason, getting given all of British television's biggest TV shows. Like, why do we keep giving him this stuff? We get like Jekyll, Doctor Who, Sherlock, like he's doing Time Traveler's Wife. It's like, what? Who keeps giving this man all of these exports? He just doesn't care. He's just fucking lazy. And that's the thing that really grinds my gears about his style, is like, it's just sort of, it's about being seen to be clever and doing clever stuff and doing cool feeling things and just kind of half-assing everything else. Yeah. Do you have anything else on the pub here?
No, I feel like there's a lot more that we could pick apart with the little kid that they talked to outside, the tour guide.
Yeah.
Because I've always wondered, like, with the was he the one who was putting the paw prints around? Because he literally has a mold with which he could do that. Like, he claims that it's the mold that he took of a paw print, but it could be the one making the paw prints. So,
I just assumed that, like, that was from the dog that the inn owners had.
I don't think so, because when we see it later, it's a normal sized dog, maybe slightly large, but the print that he held up was massive. Like it was like as big as your head. Like
Yeah,
it
we
was,
might
it
just be
was huge.
fabricating them then. Like,
So I assume that someone was out there putting fake prints around to spread this theory, and it would make way more sense that it was him versus being the doctor out there, because he didn't, like, the scientist didn't care necessarily about that. I wouldn't think. But
yeah, I mean, it could have been the
maybe.
therapist. I don't know. Like, there's a lot of, but this is the thing. Like, so this is, to me, that's a cool element. You don't have to explain everything, right? There's a bit of restraint there and just letting something be what it is, which I kind of appreciate. I think sometimes, like, there is an impulse to it's like the George Lucas problem. There's an impulse to explain everything, and like it's okay to just have stuff not be explained. Is I guess a key point there. Well, should we talk about Baskerville then?
Yes, yes.
So Sherlock and John head to the nearby Baskerville military base. Sherlock gains access by using an ID card that he swiped from his brother Mycroft. They're introduced to various officials at the base. We get Commander Barrymore. We get Dr. Jackie Stapleton and Dr. Bob Franklin. Critically, in our murder, like, mystery setup, this is meeting all of the players. This is like, these are our potential suspects, basically. I think it's really slickly done. I like the fact that, like, it's hard to explain, like, structurally why this works to me, other than it's just a very solid, like, way to do a mystery. You meet all of the people who could be the potential perpetrators. We've met the inn owners, we've met the young lad, and now we're meeting the scientists. And so we suddenly have our board set. What's really interesting is this is the scene where Sherlock deduces that Stapleton is the mother of the child who emailed him about Bluebell. And he makes this solve, he meets her and then immediately solves it. But the thing I like is that he says the word Stapleton because he's trying to figure it out. So we get reminded of it before the solve. It is,
Yeah.
This little sequence here is really, really well done. There's a ticking clock because they know that the access is going to expire and it's going to get flagged. We meet all the players. We get a nice little, like, hook into, like, okay, well, what's the connection here? We get a little bit of, like, sizzle. This is, for me, like, a really effective sequence.
And we get that same thing in the previous episode where we hear Flight 007, and then he starts going 007, 007, 007, Bond Air is a go.
Yep.
So you get the flashback to where he heard the text. So it's not just coming out of nowhere. It's like you're saying.
100%.
It's yeah, which is really cool. What I really loved was that I keep complaining they're getting John's character wrong, and they finally got something right.
One episode in the entire show, he's perfect. They get him completely right in this whole episode. It's fucking brilliant.
Yeah.
Him going into, like, military guy pulling rank mode was really cool. I like it.
Yeah.
It does imply, and I checked this because I'm not CinemaSins, but I did look this up. It implies that John's rank is a lot more senior than it is.
I wondered.
Yeah, I did check that because I knew that you were going to be like, is there?
Because he said captain. Captain is not that high.
It's a different structure in the UK than like what you're imagining. But he's really not that senior. Also, he's not in active service, so you can't pull rank like that. It's a weird. Yeah, that's not how credentials like that work, but it doesn't matter. I think it works for this scene.
Yeah, I would totally let that go. I don't care if he's been retired for like 40 years. Like, it still makes sense. Yeah. You could still pull rank in a movie, and it's fine.
Exactly.
I mean, it might not be totally credible, but
it works in the scene.
Now, one thing that I found really odd, and I'm curious about you, is the duplicate card swipes just confused the heck out of me. Because while showing your ID at the gate might be fine to get you in, why would his ID work with the internal security system at this place?
It also implies, and this is like so there's a concept in security, which is the idea. This is going to be really hard to explain. So one of the things that you want to try and do when you're making things secure is you want to have patterns that aren't repeated elsewhere. That seems really basic as an idea, right? So one of the things in API theory that I talk a lot about in my job is this idea of, like, if you unify, let's say that you have 6 systems that all want to talk to each other. If you unify the way that they do that, you're essentially creating one single thing that someone needs to crack. instead of 6 discrete things that someone needs to crack. And so this thing in security is like, obviously obscurity is important, but also uniqueness is important. And that's where, like, cryptographic sequencing is really, really useful, because you're algorithmically taking data and, encrypting it into like a different, number of bits. So like you're going to 64 bits or whatever. So you're creating entropy as you do that. And entropy creates uniqueness. The idea that Mycroft Holmes's identification card that Sherlock Holmes has swiped off of him works in this base implies that it works in every base, which implies that every base has the same security setup, which implies a lack of uniqueness in the security setups, which makes them less secure. I don't understand this conceptually, but also, if you're not a security expert, I think it's just a cool looking little moment, right? Like, it's cool to see them do the double swipes.
Yeah.
It also
the idea was... Go ahead.
The other thing it implies is that, like, this is is this how they always get around the base? You have to have someone else with you? Like, that's really confusing to me.
Yeah, although that is moderately consistent with other films and shows and stuff, is that anytime you go through a door, you got to swipe a card, you got to put a keypad, you got to scan your eye or do your palm or whatever.
Yeah.
That's not entirely abnormal for high security places in different shows, but maybe they were just going with the idea that because his brother is the British government, as they keep saying, that his card will unlock anything in the entire country, entire world, because they're in a different country. But that didn't make sense to me. What I think was that this was purely just to inject action and to give Sherlock more agency, because if he's not doing this, then he's just a little child along for the ride while the main guy suddenly has all of the authority in the situation.
Yeah.
And especially at the end there, where Sherlock is taking the lead, and I assume swiping the card first to try to hide the fact that it's no longer working. That's never really super made clear there, but it gives him a whole lot more purpose in the scene versus just following the other dude around.
Yeah. I think stylistically it helps the scene move, even if it doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
So at this point, I don't know if this is the spot to talk about Bluebell, but probably, because this is when we find out that Bluebell was real. And at first, I hated this rabbit. I just despised them injecting this idea of this glow-in-the-dark bunny because it didn't add anything to the story. And then I realized that the entire point of the rabbit is to give credence to the creation of the Hound.
Yep.
So if they created this and it is proven for the audience that it exists, then the Hound must also exist.
Yes. It's a red herring. It's adding evidence to the red herring that we were told because we were told that it can't be imaginary. This is adding more weight to that.
Yeah, which is because at the very beginning, John says, "Are you sure you're not imagining this?" And now we have physical proof. No, you're not imagining these creatures that could exist. And even her dialogue there, they're questioning her, and she's like, "Yeah, we have rats the size of this and horses the size of this," and she's like naming off these different animals and she's like, "Size isn't a problem. We can grow them as big as you want." Mm-hmm. So even the dialogue is confirming to the audience that the Hound is real.
Which is really annoying because it's a bit condescending. It's like I get that you want to have a mislead here, but it's kind of a dick move to be like, yeah, this is possible. So, because here's the thing, if it wasn't possible and we are convincing ourselves that it is, that'd be fine. But these characters are literally like, this Hound could exist in this version of reality. And then at the end, it's like, no. Like, that's silly. You're an idiot for thinking that. I don't know. It's, again, that tension between the content and then the style, and the what the writers want and then what the audience is going to receive. And that tension is really palpable with an example like Bluebell. I could feel probably a similar feeling to what you had, which is it just feels off. Like the inclusion of Bluebell, like it's fine, like I don't mind it, but it feels a little bit unusual, or a little bit like there's something about it that kind of pings in your brain is a bit weird. And I think it's that exact tension at play.
I think it's probably that it felt weird to me because it didn't feel like it fit within the overall story, and it only is in the overall story because of what we just talked about, because it's the red herring for the Hound. So you could completely cut that and it doesn't change anything for the overall story, except that the audience doesn't have this extra little tidbit of evidence to prove, the existence of the Hound. So probably that's why it comes off initially as odd to us, is because structurally it doesn't need to be there, unless proving something to the audience is something you would consider a structural necessity, which I'm not really sure about that.
Really, really good point. So, okay, yes, the question is, and there isn't an answer, I'm just saying this is the question that I think this proposes, is exactly what you said, which is like, is including something structurally in order to communicate a single piece of information to the audience, does that justify the inclusion of the content? We won't have a simple answer for that. There isn't a simple answer. The best I can do for you at a glance, because this didn't really clock to me, so I'm just sort of thinking through, I guess, the stuff that I've studied and my understanding. The best typically, I would say, is the answer is you can do this and it can work well, but what you need to do to make it work well is you need to ensure that everything you're doing, like every scene that you have, is multi-purpose. One of the problems, or one of the things that will make scenes feel lazy or feel bad or feel wrong, or scenes like this, is that if it's not multi-purpose, it kind of can be obvious, or like things can feel canny or unusual or weird. What you want to do in a scene like this is you go, okay, well, I need a scene where my character proves to the reader, or proves ontologically in this text that this giant hound could exist. That's what this scene is effectively doing. So let's say that I write that down as like the raison d'etre of this scene. What you then need to do is go, okay, well, while that's happening, I'm going to tell us a little bit about Dr. Stapleton. I'm also going to use it to communicate Sherlock's relationship to the military. I'm also going to use it to communicate the ways in which Watson's past can affect his present, and how he views his place in the military after his trauma. What you want to do is you want to have these scenes be doing multiple things at once, and what that ends up doing at a macro level, when you have it on the micro, is that everything feels organic because everything is kind of feeding off of each other, and you're always trying to do multiple things in every scene. The second you have a scene that's doing one thing, it had better be the climax of your fucking story. You had better be narrowing in on this moment of coherence where everything is funneled into this one moment, and you have a single purpose scene, which is usually like your climax, right? Think about Lord of the Rings, right? You've got Frodo and Sam at the mouth of Mount Doom. Everything falls away to that moment, and it's just about them getting the ring in. And it stops being about friendship, and it stops being about it just get the ring in the fucking pit. And then you have Frodo's turn. Those moments of single-purpose scenes should be the climax of your story, and if they're not, they always feel lazy and out of place. And so I think to give you a bit of context, I guess, from a theory perspective, I think that is the best I can do for you at a glance of, is it okay to put this in? Only if you do it properly.
Fair enough.
All right. Anything else on that one, or should we talk about the credentials and the boys getting busted?
Yeah, the next note I have is after they get outside.
Yeah, cool. So Mycroft's, the security access, I don't know what you want to call it, expires. But Dr. Franklin vouches for Sherlock's cover as Mycroft. He knows Sherlock from the blog, it turns out. And Franklin intimates that he was a friend of Henry's father, and displays, a decent amount of well-being for Henry's well-being. So it's kind of like, I don't know, there's this a little bit of something happening here with Dr. Franklin, and we go outside and we have this conversation with him. So I have a few notes in this one, but yeah, tell me about Franklin.
I mean, the biggest question I have, which we see this in multiple other films as well, but the killer giving away too much for no reason.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he literally lets the world's greatest detective escape and solve the crime that puts him behind bars.
It's so confusing.
Like, all he had to do was keep his mouth shut.
I don't understand this.
He would have got away with it.
Yeah. What's his motivation here? Is he just fucking around?
I mean, the only thing that makes sense, like, when you consider the whole story, the only thing that makes sense is that he legitimately feels so terrible about what he's been doing to Henry that he wants to get caught, But if that were the case, why does he not just go and stop Henry from dosing himself every night he goes to
Yeah,
the...
if that were true, you would just stop doing it. Like,
Yeah.
I think it's one of these, like, to your point before about, like, you know, who's this in service of? This is definitely, like, the plot falls away in service of, like, the writers feeling the need to present the viewer with this character in this way. Like, this is a real, like, this doesn't make a lot of logical sense for this character, but storytelling wise, you kind of need it in some sense.
And it might be that the only reason that this scene exists is because Sherlock cannot do the solve if he doesn't have this scene, because this is where we get him calling it a cell phone.
Yep.
So Sherlock knows he spent time in America.
Yep.
This is where he actually meets him and has... Oh, no, I think he actually meets him at the very beginning. Well, whatever. But I think that's the entire reason that scene was there, was for that later solve. But
Yeah.
even then, we've seen multiple times already in this one episode that they have scenes introduced for no other reason than for a later, plot development.
Yeah, I think it's just we're starting to see the edges a little bit of, I guess, what this style is capable of. Something I also noticed in this scene is that, and I'll try and explain this in a second, Sherlock's dialogue with other characters that aren't Watson has changed subtly. An exchange that I want to highlight is Franklin says jokingly, I tell you, so Sherlock is like, what are you working on in there? And he says, I tell you, then I'd have to kill you. And Sherlock replies with, that would be tremendously ambitious of you, which is a very well-written line. It's very funny. It's pithy, it's smart, it's cool. But something I want to call attention to is something I flagged in my initial abstract, which is the kind of, excuse me, the way that the, I was choking how good that line is the way that the style of this dialogue is shifting in a subtle direction. It's not word and speak exactly. It's something a bit more kind of fundamental to literature, where every sentence that Sherlock says in certain situations and conversations is less of a conversation, and it's more like epigram. So epigram, for those who kind of aren't familiar, epigram was this kind of ancient Greek style of communication. It was popularized, contemporaneously with Oscar Wilde. He's like obviously the biggest proponent. If you Google Oscar Wilde epigram, it is a really fun time. Epigrams are basically short, pithy, surprising, and usually kind of satirical statements. An example from Wilde that I've grabbed just to kind of give you an example of what these sound like. When asked what should you say to a customs officer, Wilde replied with, "I have nothing to declare but my genius." Pretty clever, funny guy. But and they're always kind of self-deflationary in some mechanism as well. And as we go on, Sherlock is going to start to sound more and more like this, more and more like these pithy sentences that you could put on a t-shirt. And I don't know why this is happening, other than it's a trend that's going to begin and it's going to kind of keep going, where eventually his whole personality is going to become this weird, affected Sherlock facade. He is going to diverge heavily into this. Watson is going to diverge in a different direction, and Moriarty is going to exclusively move into his own kind of affected mode of being. So I just want to call attention to it. I don't think it's worth discussing too much more detail, just flagging, because we'll be coming back to this in various stages of the show. Anything else on Franklin?
No.
Okay, because I have quite a few things to say about the visit to Knight's house, and then we might take a quick break and come back. So Sherlock and John visit Henry Knight, who tells them about the words liberty and inn that he sees in his dreams. Sherlock convinces Henry to visit them more in the hopes of confronting the Hound. Along the way, John gets distracted and ends up on this weird side quest for some Morse code. Meanwhile, Sherlock and Henry arrive at the center of the hollow, where they suddenly hear growling. John finally arrives at the top of the hollow just as Henry sees the beast and panics. The three of them leave in a hurry, Sherlock claiming not to have seen anything, but he's clearly rattled. What do you think of this little... Well, so first of all, we go to the house and then we go out to the moors. What have you got for this?
I did think it was a really odd choice that they made Henry rich and put it in the story. Like, they had dialogue where John goes, "You're rich?" and Henry goes, "Yeah, I'm rich." Like, I don't understand what that is supposed to get across, aside from maybe thinking that people who have these psychological issues don't always... They're usually depicted as being poor. So maybe the fact that he's rich is a divergence that makes the story more interesting, but I don't understand what that point adds to the story.
I
And
think
then why they went so far as to even put the dialogue in to emphasize the point, the fact that he's rich.
So I think personally, like my view would be, I think it gives him something to be exploited for. Like it gives a reason for him to be exploited. The internet does not think this stuff. The internet has some fucking crazy opinions about this, which I'll get to in a second. Like the theory crafting around Henry Knight is insane. But yeah, I don't know what it particularly adds other than like it's just a flourish that gets you that payoff at the end of the therapist being, taking advantage of him kind of thing.
Huh. Okay.
Yeah.
I did not pick up on that at all. We'll have to come back to that.
We'll come back to that.
So, other notes that I had. One really interesting thing was that we've talked about it a good bit. I think it was in the solo podcast. I think it was Rye who brought it up, and the question was, "What do they eat?" And there was a video game essay that he brought up.
Yeah.
And that was my question about the moor, because when we go out multiple times, we never see any wildlife whatsoever. When they're in Dewar's Hollow, you hear all these like birds and crickets, and you hear all this wildlife, but you never actually see anything. And so, like, my biggest question, as like they've done multiple things to make the audience believe that the hound is real, but my question was, if it is real, how is it surviving out here? Because it's desolate. There's no water. There's nothing for it to eat. So I actually just like went and just looked up some images of like wildlife out in this area, and apparently there is. Apparently there's lots of photos of animals roaming around, and there's all different kinds of species. So I think it would have added so much to the story if in starting in this scene, maybe in some of the earlier scenes, they just use some little bits of stock footage and show wildlife out there. And it would have made the idea a lot more believable, even if, I don't know if it's realistic to show that there were foxes or coyotes, but even showing other animals similar to a hound would have reinforced the idea that stuff like the hound could viably live out in this area.
Mm-hmm.
So just from a filmmaking perspective, I think that would have been a very smart choice to include those bits of stock footage in here to really sell that idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then the only other note I had about this was about the Morse code bit, because I was just laughing at the idea that they are hunting for a killer monster, and they let themselves get separated, and nobody is worried about this at all.
Yep. No one's stressed about the fact they got separated.
Now you
It's
could
so
say
weird.
that you could say both John and Sherlock are so convinced that this is all in Henry's head that they're not worried. They think there is no monster, there's no chance, there is zero probability. But there could still be coyotes, there could still be a sand pit that he falls in. I don't know there could be some natural thing out there that would kill him. So no matter what, just the overall concept, we see this even later on, that John keeps going out by himself when there's this killer monster. So I don't know if we want to say that he's confident in his fighting skills for the first time ever in the show, or he's just a dullard, which would fit more with what we've seen him depicted as in this show.
I just don't think this makes any sense. But that's fine. Like some of this stuff, they just don't care. They don't care to think about it. Like, I think that's ultimately the answer for some of this stuff, is they're not interested in paying attention to that. Which is, as we keep saying,
Really sad.
yeah, it's just like disappointing, honestly.
Yeah.
They're not particularly interested. Yeah.
All right, what'd you have for this?
So I wanted to talk a bit about the interaction with Henry Knight and the house, and just kind of, so in our kind of method here, which is really starting to pay off in my reading of these forums and these Tumblr blogs, this was the first time where that method's really paid off in an interesting way. So I want to ask you a question, which is, what do you think is the reason why Sherlock is rude to Knight in the house? He was kind of like dismissive and like a bit snooty. Like, what do you think's going on there?
I don't know if we are able to tell if his earlier cattiness towards Henry, which was very obviously indicated to be a result of the nicotine withdrawal, if we are supposed to think that that is still going on through the entire episode. There's not really any context given. I think we're supposed to believe that as soon as he gets on a case, the nicotine withdrawal is gone because he's got this flood of adrenaline and all this other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I would assume that that's not at all connected to what we saw at the very beginning of this. I would possibly think that he could be antagonizing him on purpose to see Henry's reaction, to see his state of mind when he gets scared, when he gets angry.
Yeah.
To see if there's any different physical changes, etc.
So that was sort of my assumption, was he was prodding this guy to try and work out what's going on with his because he's trying to. This guy is seeing an imaginary creature. Sherlock is prodding, trying to see what else is going on in this guy's head. That was my assumption. There is a particular meta around this moment that is part of the John Locke theory. Now, what I want to do with this, so there's there's three pillars to this theory, which I'll explain in a second. What I'd like us to do as we go through is, and I've listed them out at the end, is pay attention to the way that supporting information is naturalized. What I mean by that is, there is this thing that these theories do that I find deeply fascinating, which I talked a lot about last week, is they will, in order for this theory to be true, they will assert that other things were necessarily always true about the show, whether or not they were or not. And so when we talk about naturalization, just as a reminder for the eagle-eyed listener, that's kind of what we're talking about. So this theory, in its very rawest form, is that Sherlock is being a dick because he's jealous of Henry because Sherlock is attracted to John. So Sherlock is jealous of Henry because he thinks that John likes him. Yeah.
What?
Yeah. The Darth just made a face that is, it's baffling, dude. It's baffling.
I don't know how often I've ever literally stopped with a drink halfway to my mouth, but I've just been sitting here like.
That was like such a speechless, I don't know what to do with this. What do you mean? So this one comes from this is user just sort of happened on Tumblr by way of the Sherlock meta blog. The Sherlock meta blog has actually been really instrumental in my historical reading for this show. I've read somewhere in the neighborhood, I think, of about 80 of them now. It's a Sherlock meta blog as a resource is really useful because what it does, Darth, is it compiles a lot of these disparate theories into categories. So I can kind of go through and historically be like, what were people theorizing about John Locke at the time of this episode airing? So it's been a really, really useful resource in that sense. So I want to read you some of the stuff from this user that just sort of happened. So the first pillar of this theory is money and courtship. So I'm just going to read you these in block quotes and then get your take on them. So quote, as we see and they all do this and it drives me fucking mental. They make everything into an acronym, like all of the episode titles, and I can never remember what the hell they stand for. So anyway, bear with me. Quote, as we see in Blind Banker, which is I assume what BB stands for, Sherlock is making sure that John has money so he won't go to work and will stick around. John is clearly impressed by Henry's house and Sherlock is visibly peeved. When I first saw this with the heteronormative reading, I was confused as to why Sherlock was being a snob here. That was the only reading I could get, but it seemed thrown in for no reason. Now that I know what's really going on here, it is clear that Sherlock is just jealous because John's checking out Henry's house. End quote. So he's jealous of the money. I guess. Thoughts, feelings?
I'm pulling up the scene to go through it, and it's interesting. The first shot walking through, first off, I don't know how common this is, but his front door goes through the outdoor patio where their garden is, which just tracks really odd from a design standpoint.
Oh yeah, welcome to England, baby. That's
okay.
Very common. Yeah,
Gotcha.
yeah, very, very common.
But it's interesting that it's totally unkept and everything's kind of dirty and not well taken care of, and it's just a really good bit of scene building to show that this guy is alone and doesn't really take care of himself. But then as soon as you go inside, it's immaculate.
Yeah.
And I don't really know what that says about Because theoretically, it might have been the opposite. If you're talking about someone's psychological state, that they would be really well made up on the outside, but that's only a facade, and inside they're a mess. But with this guy, it's the opposite. And outwardly, he's a mess, but inwardly, he's totally put together. So
Yeah, there's some interesting, I guess, like thematic rhyming there. That's kind of interesting.
I don't know if they did it on purpose or not, though. Is the bigger question.
Yeah.
Um,
So do you? So yeah. So what does it read to you like Sherlock is being rude because of because he's peeved that this guy's that John's impressed?
I was also looking at the framing as they walk in. So Sherlock got ahead of them and stood there watching while John and Henry come through the door and kind of stand next to each other. So they're framed together. Sherlock is out of frame watching them, and then it cuts to him and he's upset. So I don't agree with the read, but I can understand what they're saying when they're interpreting it in that fashion. Because if you just swapped it out and it was the guy's girlfriend talking to someone and saying, "Oh, you have a really nice house. This is really fancy. You must be really rich." It would make total sense for the boyfriend to have a jealous moment there. So like it all makes sense, but there's no proof to back it up. So
let me stop you there, Darth. There is plenty of evidence. Let me tell you about it.
80 pages of evidence.
Oh, let me tell you about the evidence, baby. Quote. Second thing, the damp. Quote, another thing that I thought was thrown in for no reason. What I also love is how often these theories acknowledge that the show is lazily written and then go, no, that was on purpose. It's fascinating. Quote, another thing that I thought was thrown in for no reason was Sherlock's comment about the damp when he walks into Henry's house the next day. Throughout this show, we will see people represented by places. Mary as Leinster Gardens, Sherlock as Appledore, and John as Baker Street. When Mycroft says back to Baker Street and Sherlock smiles like he just won a prize, it's because it means back to John. This is complete nonsense, by the way. In GG, we see that Moriarty gives... like this... So I'll talk about it in a second, but the idea that people are represented by places, interesting claim. In GG, which I think is a great game, we see Moriarty gives clues through a fake pink lady phone. So the fake pink lady phone. We see people know about the case through John's blog. We see Moriarty basically making himself a facsimile of John to attempt to court Sherlock. The first clue we get through this pink phone is a picture of 221C, the crappy version of 221B. Mrs. Hudson says she can never rent it out. It's the damp. Basically, Moriarty is like John with damp, something that wants to be awesome but fails to be the real thing. Now, Sherlock walks into Henry and basically tells him that he's a facsimile and cannot compete with him. Without this analogy, he's nonetheless basically saying this house isn't so great, i.e. you're not so great, as a way to cope with his continuing jealousy. End quote. Yeah. I'm just going to give you the third evidence, and then I'm going to give you a list of all of the things that this theory presupposes are true. But I want to call out two really obvious ones. The claim that characters are represented by places is bizarre. And then the other one is this idea that 221C is like an analogy for something to do. Like the idea that 221C is an analogy for Moriarty, which is a claim that gets made a lot in these matters. Very, very weird. Third piece of evidence is John's blog. Quote, Henry, a normal-looking bloke in his late 20s. This is the quote from John's blog that this guy is quoting. He's quoting, and then it goes back to him just talking about it. So this is from John's blog. Henry, a normal-looking bloke in his late 20s, was clearly very anxious when he arrived at Baker Street. He told us about how, 20 years before, his dad had died. He told us how his dad had been ripped apart by the devil. That's the end of the quote from John's blog. Then, the first comment is quote, Henry was a normal-looking bloke? Really, John, you should become a professional author. Sherlock Holmes, 16 March, 1222. Now, on the surface, we have Sherlock mocking John's writing skills, but under the surface, we have his discomfort with John mentioning Henry's appearance at all. Now, granted, John doesn't call Henry good-looking, as he would have done in the original books. That's a well-known part of their homoeroticism. But the fact that John feels the need to comment on Henry's appearance irks Sherlock because he perceived, rightly so, that John found Henry to be an attractive man. End quote. Now, what I like about this theory is it does correctly identify something that happens in the original texts, which is that Henry Knight and Watson are attracted to each other. At least, there is the implication of homoeroticism. They don't actually like express it. So I'm just going to give you a list, Darth, of, well, first of all, how do you feel about this completely buck-wild theory and accruing all this evidence to suggest that it's because Sherlock is jealous? What's your take on that? Thoughts, feelings, emotions?
Initially, I had an incredibly pained expression on my face, which will be lovely to cut back to. I can actually get behind the idea that characters are represented by places. I don't know if this fits because there's... I think that if that would be true, it's just reading into something that the writers didn't intend to be. But in other stories, like in Harry Potter, like the aunt and uncle, like they represent that house. We never see them anywhere but that house. If you see that house, you think about the aunt and uncle. So you could think about the same thing with other places in other stories and stuff. Like the mother, when you see her, she almost always represents the home. She is. If you see the home, you think about the mother. If you see the father, typically you would think about his job. The father is always very much tied to the job wherever that job is. So the idea that a character is tied to a place makes sense, but I would not get behind the argument that any of those characters are defined by those places, because I just don't think there's proof within the text to show that. Yeah,
it's deeply, and this is the thing that these theories do a lot, is they're deeply reductive of the way that text functions as a constructed object. The idea that John represents Baker Street. So let me just read you a quick list of like the things that the ideas that you have to already have accepted to be true in order for this claim about them, this jealousy, right? This is not all of them. This is just the quick summary point. Sherlock is keeping John poor. That's the first one. Sherlock being a snob in Knight's house is because of John, rather than his general disdain for wealth or him trying to needle this guy. Moriarty tried to be like John to attract Sherlock. 221B Baker Street represents John Watson. Equally, 221C represents Moriarty as a worse version of John. And the claim that place represents people this directly, and this the representation is so direct. Those are just like a few of the things that you have to already have accepted to be true. And so when we talked a little bit over the last kind of 2 episodes about the idea of naturalization, what I've been trying to render, hopefully, is that in order for you to buy into this theory, you need to have accepted like 6 other theories already. And so you can start to see how you develop an in-group with this sort of behavior, where suddenly, as you read this theory, it's going, well, obviously, people are represented by places in Sherlock. Obviously, that's true. We're not even litigating that. We're assuming that's true. And so it just has a really interesting effect on the fact that you have to have accepted this other evidence as true. I guess what I'm trying to demonstrate here is how layered these matters will become. Right? How this is a small slice of a small part of one of the many parts of the John Locke matter. This is a very, very small vertical. The idea, I guess, the idea of this is they have to hammer the text into a shape that it needs to be for your reading to be valid. And in order to do that, you have to distort the reality of the text heavily. And one of the things that I talked about last week that we'll continue to discuss is the idea of these theories they're in direct tension with the text, because they have had to hammer their perception of the text so heavily. And what's going to happen at some point is there is going to be a breaking point for some viewers where that tension is too great, and there'll be a rupture of the reality that they have constructed. Something I want to do as a really easy explanation is, in your current setup, do you have the ability to watch a video? Will that balk your recording? Moffat explaining that Sherlock would suck to date because he's like vain and busy. So he's not saying anything about Sherlock's sexuality. He's like, Sherlock's like, Moffat's like, I imagine dating Sherlock would suck. Like his girlfriends would just like, they'd never see him because he'd always be off on some adventure.
I doubt if Sherlock Holmes ever started dating a woman that she'd ever see a mirror, because he'd be too busy adjusting his hair. It's the thing that Benedict started doing in character is every time there's a mirror, he just goes, still cool. I find no women attractive, but they better fancy me.
And the thing that these communities take from that is Stephen Moffat saying that Sherlock isn't into women, which when you watch the clip is not what is being said. And so when we talk about the way that they're in tension with the text, they're also in tension with reality itself. Like, what Stephen Moffat says about these characters and the reality, like the material reality of our world, is in tension with these theories. This is a pretty common thing with these like kind of conspiracy theory groups, right? You see the same thing with things like QAnon or like Flat Earth or whatever, where they have to construct a different version of reality in order to bend information into the explanation they've already decided. And it's something we're going to start to see a lot more. The reason I think this is a really interesting example is the text doesn't have an explanation in it for why Sherlock is rude to Knight. There isn't, like, you never really get a really good reason. But Sherlock's just a rude dude. So you don't actually really need something that concrete. Like, we've seen this before. Like, he's already just been rude to people for no reason throughout this show. But suddenly in this scene, it has a deeper meaning because we need to find evidence to support something. So instead of taking the text as it comes, which is this like kind of lazy stylistic show, it imagines a world in which anything can become supporting evidence for anything else as long as you presuppose a bunch of other ideas are true first. And that's a really complicated mechanism to try and unpack, which, you know, that's one of the ways in which this method has been paying off for me, is in reading through these forums in real time, you can see these ideas start to construct themselves over time. And it's not like, I think people imagine this stuff as like, I don't know, I think people imagine the way people get dragged into these conspiracies or whatever you want to call them. I think we always imagine it as like the Matrix thing, where it's like, do you want to take the blue pill or the red pill? But it's a lot more slow and kind of pernicious. It's a lot more of like, you go, oh yeah, I guess that does sound kind of true. Like you kind of agree with one assumption or one idea. And then because that's been naturalized, they then build on that. And then they build on this other thing. And it's slowly over time kind of layers on top of each other until you are, you know, as far away from the text as some of these guys become by the end of the show. And so I guess when we talked last time about the empathy for these people, I think it's a really telling thing that when you watch that clip of Steve talk about like what he's saying is that Sherlock would be a bad boyfriend. That's really what he's saying. But their interpretation of it is he's saying that Sherlock isn't that attracted to women. And when you watch that clip, or you'll hear it as part of this episode, think about how many degrees of separation it would require you as the person who just heard that clip to interpret it differently, to interpret it as him saying Sherlock isn't attracted to women. Just think about how distant from reality you must already become to presuppose that as true. And so when we think about the formal mode that these people are engaging with the text in, the userly engagement that we talked about from Royne's work previously, that userly engagement is so different to how we're viewing this text right now. And I think it's a fascinating thing to just stop down briefly and go, this was happening in real time with the show, and they are already this deep into it. Like, they are already that layered in after, like, you know, 2 episodes of this season. So it's no surprise. Like, you can imagine that as every season goes on, in between seasons, they're relitigating everything and doing more theory crafting and getting further and further from reality. And so we're starting to see this pattern that is going to emerge, which is they have decided that John Locke is true, and anything that is not explained in the show, and the show is full of lazy stuff, anything that is lazy essentially can then be kind of hammered and warped into supporting evidence for these theories. And it's this weird, like, perfect storm of the writers insisting the show is clever, the show being aesthetic in a way that attracts people to it in a very early internet kind of sense, and then this laziness allowing theory crafting to fill in the blanks of things that these writers ultimately just aren't interested in paying attention to. And so it's this kind of triangulation that's happening that's resulting in the possibility of these theories. I just think it's really interesting. It's complete nonsense, and it's fascinating.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought up the comparison to conspiracy theories, because I absolutely love researching conspiracy theories from a psychological perspective, if nothing else. And I love looking at Flat Earth, and I love talking about it at work because no one can take it seriously, and the parts they do take seriously, it's just really interesting. And when you like look at the research that the people have done, they will go after, you know, proving XYZ, but then when that fails, they try to prove why it failed and then they'll prove why that failed, and they have all of these different proofs to try to prove this overarching goal, and that is like so exactly what you're talking about with them trying to prove why, you know, Sherlock and John have a relationship, because if that is true, then we have to prove this and we have to prove this.
Yeah.
And if that's not true, then it must not be true for this reason. There has to be a reason, because they already have the conclusion that they want, so they have to figure out how to get there. And
Yeah, it's exactly,
no matter
that's
what
exactly
conspiracy
it.
you look at, it's the same thing. And it would be really interesting to figure out, you know, what is the mindset that these people have, where they are so intent that what you saw can't be the real thing. It has to be this other thing. They need something deeper, something more secret, something more special. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's probably, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about this in general, and I'm sure we'll keep talking about it as the show goes on. I think ultimately what it comes down to is this tendency people have to want to take the complexity of reality and make it into something really simple. And like everything, like create some kind of a simple explanation, right? You see that with like, you know, the development of religion as a technology. That was, as a technology, religion kind of developed in order to explain the entropy of reality in a way that was digestible. And I think what you see with like the flat Earth theory and with QAnon and all these different conspiracies and things like that is this desire to reduce the complexity of reality into like explainable, identifiable problems that have solutions. The idea that reality is so unendingly complex and full of randomness, and is so uncomprehendable that the Earth is round and it doesn't make sense to us because it doesn't match our experience of looking out. Now, you can see that the Earth is round just with your own fucking eyes. That is possible. But the notion of the complexity required behind that is too much. And so I think the instinct is we need to simplify and unify. There needs to be a unifying theory for everything, right? The notion that the way a mountain develops and the way that like a fox came to evolve, they're so fucking complicated as concepts, and they are so nuanced and complex and full of entropy that it's easier to say, well, it's all part of one plan. It's all God's plan. That instinct I completely empathize with. Because reality is big and scary. And when you think of a show like this, we sort of try and scope in on one particular community, it is this instinct that like this thing that they are really invested in, this idea of Sherlock and John, say for example, being homosexual. They are so invested in this, and they're so far into this different version of reality than we're experiencing, that it seems like it would be a scary concept to abandon that belief and to acknowledge that like, hey, I was wrong about this. And if everybody else around you is making similar truth claims and supporting your and providing you evidence that your perception of reality is already true, that as an idea, I understand can be very comforting and is a way of dealing with a lot of those scary concepts and ideas, because you already have a unifying theory for how it should work.
And it's weird because you could see it the opposite as well, or you do see it very frequently where it's going from positive to negative. Like what you were just describing is more of like they are seeing something negative and trying to turn it positive. But for instance, like the Star Wars fans who hate everything Disney has done, they cannot acknowledge when Disney does something right. Yeah. If there's an episode of Kenobi, if there's an episode of Mandalorian, if there's something that is amazing, they cannot acknowledge it because their worldview is that Disney has ruined Star Wars.
Yes.
So they have to find something wrong with what everyone is saying is amazing, because that's their belief. And so they'll jump through all of these same hoops that these guys are jumping through to prove the John Locke thing. Mm-hmm. And you see the same thing in so many different places. It's just really interesting.
Yeah. I think one other thing.
I had a completely different point, so go ahead.
Okay, yeah. I was just going to say the other thing to think about there is something that we've mentioned a few times is the idea of text are constructed objects. Like a text is authored, and you create a text, And it does not, meaning is not made in a text, like it is not made in its generation, it's made in its reception. A lot of these types of viewers or people in this usually engagement mode mistake meaning at the time of creation. So they presuppose that the sequel trilogy of Star Wars is bad because they've got a female character who can do too many things, or because there's a lead black character, and there's some potential queer baiting there that they don't like. They are presupposing that the meaning of the text is generated at its time of creation instead of at the time of reception, which is like how text generally functions. Is like when you watch it, that is when you make meaning out of it. Now, you can talk about it and you can have someone describe to you what's in it, but in the same way that, as a really easy example, because I covered this on a podcast a while ago, in The Last of Us Part 2, which was a really famous video game, one of the main characters from the previous game dies. And people had decided before they played the game, because this information got leaked, they decided before they played the game that this was like SJW propaganda. It was an excuse to have a female main character. And when you hear the author of that text, Neil Druckmann, who has some questionable politics, granted, when you hear him talk about it, it's got nothing to, like, it has nothing to do with gender politics. It's about the story that they're trying to tell. And I think in this mistake that we keep talking about of the way that they're approaching these texts and engaging with them is like a fundamental one. Like it is a first year writing course. Like, you have to understand this in order to talk about the craft and to be taken seriously about stories and texts and to a certain extent reality at a certain point, right? If you, I've said this before, but like if you reacted to The Last Jedi and your opinions of it were to do with the race and the gender and the ethnicity and you know, Rey being too good and all this stuff, if you reacted that way and failed to acknowledge some of the really interesting and good things that Rian Johnson did, exactly what you're describing, only taking the negative, you should not be taken seriously about text. And you should acknowledge that you are not a serious authorial voice in these contexts. You have to say to yourself, I am not viewing this as craft. I am viewing this through my own myopic lens of what I've already decided. You have to acknowledge that. Otherwise, you are, by definition, being disingenuous and misrepresenting the very nature of text. And I think for me, as someone that has spent, you know, most of my academic life studying this stuff, it is deeply, deeply concerning that some people think and have been exposed to understanding text in that mode and still believe that to be true. Still believe that text functions as a means of conveyance of politics at the time of its creation instead of something that is experienced at the time of reception that is influenced by the way it's crafted. That for me is so fundamental in understanding what stories are that I think it bears repeating here, because I have and again, I have a lot of empathy for people in that situation. I get it. I was a shitty teenager as well. But at a certain point, you need to grow out of that, and you need to, if you would like to have things to say about text, you need to grow out of that and learn how to engage with it as it is, as an object in reality, instead of your perception of what that object is trying to do in your distant reality that you've created. And I think it is essential in these conversations that is acknowledged, and that if you're allowed to have the opinion that it's bad because Rey's can do all this, too many things. She knows the Force too easily. You're allowed to have that opinion. That's fine. But you need to provide textual evidence for why you think that. And if it's an emotive argument, you just need to acknowledge that and be like, it's because I don't like women. That's fine. You can have that opinion. We can disagree on that, but you have to acknowledge where it's coming from. You have to acknowledge that you have presupposed that truth claim and you're finding evidence for it. Obviously, that doesn't happen because as you do that, that self-awareness usually distances you from those opinions and that mode of engagement. But because I know I'm going to get emails about this, because I always do when I bring this stuff up. If you feel that way, that is fine. But just be honest about it. If you can't be honest with yourself, then what chance in hell do you have with being honest with reality?
It's really interesting to think about the audience interpretation. When they view the content versus when the content was created, and what what ideas the creators had when they first created the content. Because when I went back and watched, what was the Maverick was part 2, what was part 1?
Just Top Gun.
Top Gun. Okay. I grew up watching Hot Shots, so I literally never watched Top Gun because I didn't need to.
You didn't need to because you were already well in. Yes, my stepdad was a military man, so I grew up watching a lot of Top Gun.
So I only just watched Top Gun right before Maverick came out because I wanted to see it and know what I was going into with part 2, and I was absolutely shocked because there was one scene where he walks into the ladies' restroom to try to proposition her, and the story treats it as normal for there to be no boundary for men to be able to do whatever they want in that context. And that just blew me away because obviously back in the day that was far, I don't know if I should say normal, but it wasn't as taboo as it is now, where there is this strict boundary and you are not supposed to cross this boundary, and films normally would have the female say, "Get out, you're not supposed to be in here." They would acknowledge that this is a boundary you have crossed. And I'm sure there's all kinds of different films that we could pull up that would say, this was okay back then. This is nowhere near okay to do now. And it just made me realize how film and TV, like, I don't even know if I could say that it's been around for 100 years. I mean, I know it's been around since 1920 or something, but as a like blockbuster medium, it hasn't been around long enough for us to really have such a diverse. We're not able to see the original people who were the white actors who were doing blackface and then compare it to what's going on now, just because we don't have that. It's not old enough. We don't have viewers who are going back and viewing that content, comparing it to current content. I don't know. It was just a really weird realization that we're still kind of at the birth stages of film as a medium.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a fascinating thing as well because literature's been around for a lot longer and is a much more mature like branch of academia. I think the modern media criticism movement, the kind of contemporaneous, the Waypoint style, the range touches, like you're kind of like you're kind of. We always talk about it as like your video essay era of criticism is the way it's sometimes described, is largely academics who were in one branch that have then diverted into this new mode. And so I think what's interesting about the way that we think about film, the way that a lot of media critics in this space think about film is we think about film as a different type, like a different medium of text versus the medium itself, which is, to your point, relatively young. And so there's an interesting tension there. Like the idea that filmmaking hasn't been around for that long, but that the fundamentals of the storytelling that filmmaking uses as a like method of conveyance has been around for ages. And that's part of the tension that like this show will get to, which is like, it's the thing I keep talking about. Like the story it's trying to tell and the thing you're looking at can sometimes be really at odds. And it just like, it can create some really interesting scenarios where you just kind of like the medium and the message can completely conflict in ways that is difficult. I mean, the most obvious example of that dissonance is something like the Michael Bay Transformers films, where Megan Fox's character in that is, if you read the script, she is like really smart, really handy, solves a lot of problems, but the medium, which is the filmmaking apparatus, leers at her as a sexual object, and it obfuscates the actual meaning of the text, which is that she's actually quite savvy. She's really the one that saves the day in that film. But because of the way that the camera is utilized to portray that character, the medium like trumps the message at a certain point. And that's one of the unique things about film, is that you have the visual, the audio, and then you also have the meaning making. And that's what I was saying before. At the time of reception is how that's conveyed. It doesn't matter that in that script she is this like really competent, highly effective, agent with her own will and free will and her own talents. What matters is that at the time of reception of the text, you see it the way that Michael Bay has filmed it, and it changes the way that message is received. And so, for a really simple example, it is not enough to say they made Rey too powerful or like she can do too many things. That is an insufficient claim. What you have to do is say, okay, well, in the script, it is structured this way and she can do these things. But in the moment of reception and in the conveyance of that information, what is the whole medium telling you about that particular idea? It is fascinating how that all kind of links together a bit. I think it's a really interesting observation that we'll keep coming back to.
So as a final note before we break, you just were talking about that video clip that you're going to send me, and I thought it was so fascinating that as you described it, it was Moffat talking, and his perception of who Sherlock would be dating is a woman that would sit at home because she wasn't able to do the stuff that he does. So there is something initially incredibly sexist about his opinion of what women are capable of.
Yep.
Which you have said before, but it just comes out so much in that little quote.
Yeah. Look, I'm not in the business of like I said before, what's in a text is not representative of what an author believes. J.K. Rowling doesn't think that like people who aren't purebloods are, less than, right? You can write an evil character and not believe in their opinions. Moffat's relationship to women textually and in reality is really fascinating. There's something, I don't want to talk about it now because I think it's much more served in the final season, but like this tendency of his opinion for women sneaks out sometimes. And he's not that unprogressive in his general politic. Like he's fairly good in my opinion. His politics aligns mostly with what I think it should, but he is very conservative when it comes to women. And obviously we've already seen his relationship to homosexuality is kind of troubling. And I think they're all part of the same tapestry and part of the same thing, which kind of seems to run throughout his professional career. That all started on coupling. It's just like fully matriculated now. And really reared its head in his adaptation of Dracula as well, where queerness was kind of wielded in a very particular way. Same with women and femininity. I mean, it's no small feat that he finally invents a compelling, rounded female character in Sherlock and then immediately kills her. Like, Mary's in it for like an episode and then she gets murked. Like, it's just ridiculous. But yes, you're right. It is very...
I also just came to the weird realization that I also didn't grow up watching any of the classic Dracula movies you probably watched, because I grew up watching Dracula Dead and loving it.
Oh my god.
And
yeah, I think America was a mistake. I think that's still true. Honestly, fucking hot shots. Jesus Christ. Yeah, it's possible we consume different texts as you.
Yes.
Fucking hell. God, it could have been worse. At least we both watched Sherlock. Fucking hell. All right, we're gonna have a quick break. When we get back, we are going to probably get into the meat of this episode. I mean, there's not a lot of plot left, really. So we'll kind of get through that, and then we'll see how we go. So we'll have a quick break. We'll be right back with you. Give Up After 3 is a production of Zero Indent. If you like the kind of content we make, you can find more at zeroindent.com, or if you'd like to support us and get all of the episodes of this season right now when you're listening to it, you can head to patreon.com/zeroindent. Even a few dollars a month helps us out. We know this content isn't for everybody. It's a very specific kind of media criticism. So if you do enjoy it, consider supporting us and maybe tell a friend who you think might enjoy the show. And if not, enjoy the rest of this episode.
All right, for better or worse, I decided to do a second recording on my video, but I left the audio running. So,
all right, cool. All right, welcome back. We're going to talk about Sherlock being visibly scared by the Hound here. So back at the pub, and Sherlock is kind of like wigging out. John is it's a really weird interaction. And so John, having pursued the Morse like signals, turn out to be just like headlight flashes. It's a weird joke. And on his way back, Sherlock basically says to John, hey, can you go and interview Henry's therapist, Dr. Louise Mortimer? During the interview, Franklin drops by and blows John's cover, revealing him to be Sherlock's assistant, and Mortimer takes off. Thoughts on this little sequence here? Seeing Sherlock be all wigged out and shit?
Yeah, I absolutely loved
Kinda
it because
freaky.
it's something so different from what we've seen. I love how Benedict played it. It was an interesting kind of throwback to the very beginning because we also see at the beginning of the episode when Sherlock is watching the little documentary that Henry brings along with him, and you see his I don't remember if he's got his hand on his face and his pinky is just like twitching like this, and you're meant to think that it's the nicotine thing,
Yeah.
and then you see this twitching later on, but now it's shaking from fear. I don't know if they intentionally put those two things together, but yeah, I mean it was beautiful.
works.
I
Yeah.
loved seeing him legitimately frightened because he can, and it wasn't it's really funny because it's not the thing that scared him, it was his not knowing what the thing was. It was that his grasp of reality was shaken, and
Yes.
that's what shook him up so much. So that
I quite like him
Yeah.
drinking
Yeah.
drinking whiskey as well. I thought that was a neat little touch.
It was beautiful, and I would have actually totally been fine, and it may have played really well to that earlier scene if John was like, he sees how shaken up Sherlock is, and he goes over and he gets a cigarette from someone, and then he goes and gives it to Sherlock. Like, that would have
Yeah.
tied in beautifully. He's
Yeah.
like, you don't need to kick this habit now, you need to calm down, you know?
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That would have been cool. Good pitch.
Aside from that, I had mentioned this earlier of when John goes out on the moor to try to figure out what's going on, and he sees the cars out there. This is the second instance of him going out into the wild where there's a killer monster out, and he doesn't think twice about it. Yeah. And then
Brave John. Brave
I
John's
also
back.
was the placement of everything. Maybe I could just get over this. This isn't cinema sins like you like to say, but how could he see those? Gotcha.
Oh, I
Okay.
have a
But
cinema sin
how
in a
could
second.
they see
so
those
don't worry.
cars both from Dewar's Hollow and from the inn where they're staying? And how was John able to walk to the cars from the inn and it not take multiple hours? Yeah, I could let this go just saying
television,
it's
I
just
guess.
it's TV, but
Yeah.
still, even if he had just like stole some kid's bike and he rode that out to the cars, at least that would have indicated that the writers thought about how do we get him physically out there instead of just having him walk 5 miles in the dead of night. So that was really the only
Yep.
the only thought I had.
point.
Everything inside was fantastic. I loved the joke of the Morse code, and like you think it's going to be this big thing, and then
Yeah,
it
I thought
turns
that was
out- 'cause
funny.
That's something that they probably don't really do enough. Is that they think there's this big mystery, and then it turns out that it's just natural human stupidity, or it's just a natural occurrence, or it's just a bird flew by the window, or something. You know, like that should happen more than it does.
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah, I mean, the show gets way too up its own ass for that at a certain point, where it's like everything has to be connected. Okay, on the note of cinema sins, I have a cinema sin for you. John says, "All right, Spock," to Sherlock, which implies that Star Trek exists, which implies that Star Trek The Next Generation exists, wherein Data performs the stories of Sherlock Holmes on the holodeck, which can't be true because the original Sherlock doesn't exist in this universe. This is one of those things, again, I mentioned this last episode, and I'm not doing this to be cinema sins. Do not reference other fictional things in your fiction unless you are certain, unless you are certain that those texts make sense for your universe, just don't bring them up. Like, this is just really lazy at a certain point. And I just wanted to call attention to it. It's a real, it doesn't add anything to the scene. It's not that funny. And it's just, it's a real miss.
I was
it's
a bit
real,
curious if that
misstep, I think.
maybe had some other meaning. I was like, they really didn't just reference Star Trek, did they? There's got to be another meaning to that, but apparently not.
Yeah, that's the whole thing. Yeah. Whoops. Forgot that Sherlock's in Star Trek. Whoopsie.
Con.
Okay, so
Yeah, like
Oh my god, I
literally-
forgot that he's in Star Trek. Oh my god. Oh my god. Holy shit. That's melted my brain. Oh my
Was
god.
this film before or after that? I think it was before.
Goofy.
Well before.
Well before. Yeah, well before. Fuck, that's goofy. That's so goofy, Darth. He's in Star Trek. Oh my god. Oh my god, he's can't. Oh my god. Holy shit. Oh my god. That's so goofy, man. I hate it.
Which is
I
funny
fucking
because
hate
I
that.
was
That's
like, my
making
brother and I
brain
were
hurt.
ecstatic when he
Oh,
got
I
named to play
forgot.
Khan because we loved his interpretation of Sherlock, and we were assuming Khan was going to be a very, very similar take. But then that movie was kind of just a train wreck.
Yeah. I'm not. I don't know how I'm gonna recover from that. Like, he plays Khan, who killed Spock. What the fuck? Oh my. Anyway, Jesus Christ. Okay. You've done me physical harm.
Remember,
Darth.
that was a different
so,
future though.
okay, to
so
try and move
he kills
on,
Kirk in this one.
Yeah, I know, but it's the same. It's still brain melty to dumb, bad, goofy. Goofy as hell. Anyway, so yeah, John tries to flirt with the therapist.